Hi everyone, it's 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. Today we're going to be talking to you a bit more about workflows, learning some best practices and misconceptions. So just a couple housekeeping items before we get into it. We are going to be doing a Q&A session at the end, so please send your questions throughout the presentation, but we will be answering them after. And there is going to be a recording of the presentation sent out in your emails about a week after the presentation. And now I'm going to pass it off to Eric.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Just like to introduce myself. I'm one of the co-founders and director of customer experience at SmartSimple. And just thank you for your time today in attending our webinar. We'll be reviewing workflows. So what to expect in this webinar is just an overview of the workflow engine, how that works. And we're going to be talking about some tips and common misconceptions. So rather than being a how-to type of webinar, this is more of a discussion and sort of to give you a better explanation of how the workflows work and what their intentions are and things to avoid when setting up workflows within your systems. So to start that, just maybe talking about maybe a common problem and solution. So just the beginning there, it is a powerful tool, but, to quote some others, with that great power comes great responsibility. So, when workflows work, they're really good and they can really help you along with your business process. But when they're misconfigured or don't work properly, they can really mess things up. So typically, what would you use the workflow for? So it's a problem, you need to automate a business process, and you're thinking of the workflow could probably help you out here, and that's one of the major features of the platform. But sometimes you may run into problems or it's just not working as desired, or maybe you're unsure of how to set it up. So I think to solve this problem is an awareness and understanding of how they work. So today what we'd like to do is provide a basic overview of how the workflows were meant and designed to work, and hopefully that'll help you avoid some common mistakes. And also will provide you with some tips to use when you are configuring your own workflows. So what are the benefits of the workflows? Well, it's a power tool to automate your processes or tasks. You can automate a lot of mundane activities, maybe sending emails, creating files, updating fields, helps you that way. Automating communication is very handy to make sure people get notifications when they submit their applications or apply online or create a new profile, things of that nature. It also gives you an auditable list of tasks. So every time the workflow runs or performs an automated task, it actually tells you, and you have a recorded history of that too. So the benefits of automating these isn't that they just happen behind the scenes, but you also get a log and a record of it. And it also can help to ensure that certain processes are being followed and the right steps are taken. So by performing workflow tasks, you can control, the steps that need to happen, and those pieces of the puzzle as part of your business process will take place, rather than relying maybe on human errors like, oh, I forgot to send that email, or I didn't update that field. Workflow advice. So this is, and I'll go into the system a little bit, talk about these in more detail, but maybe we'll start with the tips side first. So when I say tips, maybe it's really just some best practice as well. So workflows are meant to operate sequentially. So one at a time and in order. They don't work very well if you try to run them in parallel. So, think of it, just like a computer only does one thing at a time. It just does one thing at a time very quickly. So it looks like it's doing many things, but it can actually just handle one thing at any given time. It's not a very good, workflows are not good multitaskers. So you want to make sure that when you set up your tasks, you're doing them in the order of operations that you want, and take into account that they should happen one step at a time, all the way through completion. Workflows can only be assigned to a status at one workflow per status. So you can't have two workflows triggering at the same time based on a status trigger. So you need to, if you need different tasks, you need different things to happen during that workflow, then you need to either branch out or connect to a different workflow to do that. They can't be assigned to, you can't have two workflows connected to the submit status, let's say. And the system will tell you that. It will give you an error if you try to do so. And again, it kind of follows on that first tip, but each workflow should finish before moving on to other functions. You'd want to do all the steps first in that workflow, and then go ahead and connect to a different workflow, and it can run a whole bunch of tasks as well. That's the, again, going back to the sequentially, it should run it in a serial kind of setup, not a parallel. So common mistakes. The first one is probably the biggest problem. You don't want to run multiple workflows on the same record. So, how can you do that if you can only have one workflow per status trigger? But let's say I have a workflow that starts on the submit action, right? So I submit my record from draft to submit. Workflow fires, and then I have a workflow doing its steps. What you don't want is to then, if there's a task in the workflows where you can link to another workflow. What you want to avoid is that second workflow also doing work on that record that triggered it. So if I have a grant and I trigger a workflow, maybe it's stamping a field for the date and time that it was submitted, maybe I'm sending out an email out, but my other workflow triggers, and maybe it's doing some other things. Maybe it's creating records, or it's also updating fields. That can cause a problem. If they're both trying to access the same record or same information, or even worse, the second point, creating a dependency. So you're assuming that the first workflow is going to run perfectly, and the second workflow is dependent on some of the tasks that the first workflow is doing. That's a problem, because now you have them running in parallel, and maybe something as simple as, oh, you wanted to create a PDF of the application form. But in your second workflow, you have a task that says, oh, email that PDF to the applicant. Well, if the other workflow, the second workflow, gets to the email task faster than the first workflow can create the PDF, then you're going to have a situation where that file is not there for that task to take advantage of. And that's a pretty simple problem, but it could get a lot worse if you're doing things with calculations or updating fields. Maybe I'm looking for a particular timestamp or dollar values to be inserted into a budget or calculations, then it can get really wrong. So you really don't want to create dependencies. And again, it goes right back to that, run things in order. You can do a lot of things with the workflows. Just do them step by step. Also to be aware of is, when a workflow fails, it can cause all the other tasks to fail. So in my example, if you have two workflows competing against each other, it's not only that one task can stop, it can actually cause the whole workflow to fail. So now you have two workflows that never got to completion, where maybe you're relying on that information to, for part of your business process, and then now it never happened. Maybe that PDF file didn't get created, that email never went out, the date time didn't get stamped appropriately. Now you have a record that you're expecting all these things to happen, and it just didn't take place. And now you're going to have to go and troubleshoot and cause a lot of problems. Another point is triggering workflows on related records. So it's not about the same record, but let's say I have a report, and when I fill out my report, I update some information on the grant application. So that's fine. It sounds pretty simple. I have my report. I update tasks on my grant. Excellent. But what if there are three reports that come in at the same time, all triggering the same workflow, and they're all trying to update the grant at the same time? Then what happens? And you're probably thinking, oh, the chances of that are pretty slim. But you start dealing with not just one grant, but maybe 1,000 grants, not just one report, maybe hundreds of reports. So the chances start to increase the more people you have using the system. So that's something to be aware of. You don't want to have workflows triggering and all working at the same time, all on the same thing, same record. And there's a setting in the workflows that say termination or prevent the termination of pending workflows. I think the idea is there is, oh, that's okay. If I do have two workflows working on the same thing, then don't stop it, keep it working. But that's actually not what that setting is meant for. It's actually, you can create workflows that have pending tasks, something that's going to happen in the future, or send a reminder 3 days before the due date, right? So that could be sitting there for months waiting for the due date to appear. That's what that toggle is going to do. It's going to say, don't cancel any pending tasks, let them stay there. One thing I didn't write down, I thought I would talk about it more than having it in here is these recurring workflows. What you don't want to do, and sometimes, you know, I know they've been set up in the past and by us as well, in that the workflow is checking every day to do something. It's like, oh, did this happen yet? Did this happen yet? You want to avoid those, and it's not that they'll break. That's more from a performance perspective. So, you know, if it's checking every day on one grant, that's not a big deal. But again, you start multiplying that by hundreds of grants, maybe by 3 or 4 workflows doing the same thing, and now you're getting into the thousands, or not tens of thousands, of workflow tasks that are running each and every day, checking to see if something's happening. And I'll show you when we get into the demo in a second of how you can avoid things like that. Instead of a recurring, you can actually use delays on the tasks and say, oh, just wait, you know, 3 days before this due date, and that's fine. So without further ado, I'll go into our demonstration. And I just wanted to point out some of the things I was talking about. And I created a sample workflow here for you to look at and kind of point out the areas that I was talking about. So in this case, in my workflow sample, and again, it's not really a training session, everyone. It's just more to put some frame of reference over the things I was talking about. In this case, I've linked a workflow to my Grants Manager UTA. You'll see all the UTAs in here, some that you may or may not be using, even some other features like email broadcasts or files and organizations, things of that nature. Down here is the main trigger, right? So what status would you like this workflow to trigger on? I left it as deactivate because I don't actually want it to run, just for a sample. But this is where you would put in the one that you chose. And this is the error message that I was talking about. If another workflow is already using that status, you will be warned and say, hey, you can't have 2 workflows triggering at the same time. Okay. One thing to point out about the Deactivate that people may not know is if you are launching another workflow from one workflow, it's okay to be on Deactivate. Deactivate actually, it doesn't mean that the workflow is deactivated. It just means that a status change won't trigger it. But you can trigger that workflow from another workflow, and that's fine. The termination trigger is very important as well, because you can cancel all the pending tasks when the workflow gets to a particular status. So this is also, you know, something to keep in mind too if you're building your workflow. So another little tip is, you know, put some thought into this, because let's say, you know, going back to my reminder use case, maybe you had a 30-day reminder, 15-day reminder, and a day before reminder. But let's say I was diligent and I actually submitted my report in time. You don't want me to get the reminders. It's like, hey, I was good. I did submit my report. So you may want to say, well, terminate this workflow if the status of the thing, the report, maybe in my example, gets to the submitted status, and then it will cancel any of the pending tasks that were outstanding. So it'll stop those reminders from going out. And that's a nice feature there. So it's, you don't get, you know, you don't have to worry about people getting emails that they shouldn't get to anymore. All right. And this is the avoid termination of pending workflows. So this is basically stopping other workflows. So if I have a task here that's pending, it just will keep it, it'll avoid canceling those. It doesn't mean that the workflow is going to run no matter what. It just means that if there is a pending task waiting there, it won't stop them. Okay. And sometimes, you know, you can kind of prevent, if someone changes the status twice within 15 seconds, maybe you made a mistake, you can prevent the workflow from triggering again, you know, within 15 seconds of each other. Perfect. And the history here is going to show a log of whenever the workflow happened. Again, that's a good audit trail. Pending queue is handy to see any tasks that are outstanding or waiting to happen. Okay. But really what the workflow falls under is the tasks. So the tasks are the things that you want the workflow to do. So once we've defined our workflow, we've associated it to our proper UTA, and we've defined when it happens, now we have to say, well, what is it that you want us to do? So this is an example of some common tasks that we do. A nice way to view your workflow is check the diagram. The diagram will show you, and they can get a little hard to read depending on how many branching logic you have in there, but this will show you all the tasks. The tasks are in the blue circle, and the decision points, the connectors, are in the green diamonds. Every workflow should have a start, and a complete. If you see that they're not there in the diagram, then it could be something's wrong. However, you can trigger out to another workflow in a different way that will not show a complete status, but that's you can call us if you have that issue. But typically, every workflow should have a start and a finish, regardless of how many branching connectors that you have. So let's start with the task list. And I think another tip for workflows is a good idea to either draw out or define the steps that you want to do and create the tasks first. So if you're going to build a workflow from scratch, first, create it, define when is it going to be activated, and then list out the tasks. And it's always useful to maybe even draw a diagram on paper and kind of step through it and say, well, what should happen and what are the tasks that I want to take place? So in this case, it's pretty easy, but it's also a very common thing that happens. I want to send a notification, right? I want to send an email to a person. Let's use my example of when a grant is submitted. I also want to update a field. I want to do a date and time stamp to say, my grant was submitted on this date and time. So we have a record of when that happened. We also want to generate a PDF file. And really what this is going to do is take that print preview, that web page view that a lot of people have on their records, and actually lock it down and make a PDF file so that at the time of submission, I have a locked record of what the values were at that moment in time. I mean, we always know that by the change log history and things like that, but it is nice having a PDF of what was submitted at the time of submission. And then I'm going to use the workflow to save me, this is going back to my mundane tasks, create a report for me. So since I know that I need to create a final report for all of our grants, then why not have the system do that? So I'm going to create a new activity that creates a report for my grant record by the workflow. And then I'm going to go ahead and I have some other stuff I want to do, so I'm going to trigger another workflow. And I left that last on purpose. So I wanted to make sure that all my tasks were completed before I went somewhere else. And my other workflow, which is just pretend for now, I didn't have one, but I just want to make sure that other workflow doesn't have anything to do with this record, or if it does have to come back here, it's going to do so after this workflow is finished. It's not going to, I didn't trigger it up here at the first task while I'm still doing other things, and it's going to also want to do things within my record. Okay, so within the tasks themselves, just quickly, routing, pretty important. There's different ways that you can determine who gets what. In this case, we have some options based on roles, people who are associated to the record, whether it's the owner, people in particular role who initiated the workflow. You can do things like that. You can do it based on people who are assigned to the record, or you can come up with your own logic and say, well, I need to send this workflow to various people, and I can use syntax. Most commonly in this case would be list syntax. And again, I don't want to go into there today, but that's what those options mean. We get a lot of questions about those. And then the template is just your template. So you feel free to pull in variables. You can attach it back to the event. You can actually send the emails immediately. Workflows will run every 5 minutes. That's another thing to be aware of too. The workflow processing, so it could take up to 5 minutes for an email to get sent. If you want that email going out right away, you can enable that feature. And some best practice here, guys, is to, if you're using workflow from addresses like a do not reply at myfoundation.org, then the best thing to do is set that up as a system variable. So, maybe you got 100 emails going through workflows. You don't want to have to change that from address for each and every email that you may run all the time if you decide to change the email address. So you can set up these system variables where you don't have to change it in one place, but you refer to them here in the from address. And again, for in the Q&A portion, feel free to ask me some of these questions, but a lot of these features you can feel free to call us about, and we can help you with them individually as it pertains to your organization. So again, here we can update fields. Okay, in this case, I'm updating a standard field of start date with the current date. Okay, we're logging those status changes anyway, but like I said, it's nice having a field that captures the date that it was submitted, just easier to find or reference later. Creating PDFs is very easy through a workflow. We have a task for that. You just generate the PDF file. All you have to do is reference your web page view field and then say, what field you want to store that on. You just have to start typing in the box, and it'll pull up the relevant custom fields. And I don't know if you knew this, but you can even change the language. We can actually convert using a Google translation. Maybe you want a copy of the application in a different language, depending on the region or location that you're in. So that's some handy tips there too for you for workflows. When creating activities, this is the, guess what, another task. Create a new activity. Again, pretty easy. I can choose my subject line. I can choose what type of activity I want to create, set the status. Maybe I want to delay when that gets created. But speaking of reminders, you can actually, put reminders based. There's a reminder feature built into level 2 activities and level 3s that's out of the box. You don't even need to build workflows for them. So if anyone has any questions on those, feel free to reach out to us. We can explain how they work. Because a lot of times you wouldn't even need a workflow. You can just use the built-in reminder features. Okay. And if you had some, this one here that I was showing, it's just going to create a new activity right away. You could schedule your activities. Maybe you have a number of reports that are dependent on a particular date. So if it's a year-long date, you can choose the start and end dates fields to pick from. And then it'll say, create a report monthly or annually for, depending on how many times that occurs within your date range. You can pick what numeric fields should be used to represent the amount, what date field should be entered, things of that nature. So you can create that. Another nice option is actually you can create it dynamically. You can have a field at the level 1, at the grant level, that says, how many of these do we need? And the system will just say, oh, you said 10, so I'll just create 10 activities. All right. And finally, this is probably the most, pretty powerful task trigger. But again, this one is the one probably to be used with the most caution. This is triggering another workflow. So here it says, well, it's going to show all the other workflows in the system. And it says, well, which one do you want to connect to? When you do that, you need to be careful because it needs to know what it's referring to. And this can be a complicated part of the task. So when you're triggering another workflow, you have to say, well, when you run that workflow, I need you to do it on these things. It needs to know which record that you're referring to. And this is where, things can be problematic. So if you have, let's say you had 3 workflows all referencing back to the same record, the same grant, and they're all trying to do their task at the same time, that's when you could run into problems. So if you are going to use this task, just do so knowingly that it shouldn't be triggering other workflows. Keep in mind the potential for other workflows referencing back to this workflow at the same time. Again, I'm not going to get into the kind of a training portion of here how to create this logic in the field, but you can call our business solutions or support teams for help with that. If we go back to the workflow, one of the ways to help with that last task there is this new feature that we've added, telling you where the workflows are being connected to. So the source tab is showing you all of the workflows referring to this workflow. Okay, so in this case, we don't have any. In the target tab, it's saying all of the other workflows that we're referencing from this workflow. So when I come here, I can say, oh, right, Eric, this workflow actually starts another workflow called test related to tracking activity assignment. So maybe I should take a look at that workflow to see what it's doing to make sure I don't have any conflicting tasks, or if it's referencing back to the record that I'm currently on and can be problematic. So again, this was just a high-level overview of our grants, and hopefully this will give you a better understanding of how it's meant to work and sort of the, some of the methodology that you should use when it comes to creating workflows in your systems. So I'll pause now, and Sarah, maybe if we have any questions from any of the attendees.
Can you run multiple workflows on the same record as long as they are at different statuses?
So good question. So just to make sure I understood, so the question is, Can I run multiple workflows on the same record as long as they're in different statuses? Yes. So that would mean they would be triggered by different statuses. And when I say that, I mean that using this trigger option here. So I definitely could have triggers for the same record throughout the various stages of the record's life cycle, let's say. So sure, you can have things that happen at submitted for my record, and then when it goes to under review, then a whole bunch of other stuff can happen. So that's okay because that's sequential. So they won't happen at the same time.
Are there best practices or any special considerations for adding new tasks to an existing workflow?
Yeah, good question. That's very difficult, and we're actually encountering a lot of that now with a lot of the kind of COVID disaster relief we're being helping people out with, is trying to incorporate a new process into an existing process. So in that case, you have to be very mindful of what's happening here and using your connectors. So great question, because one thing that I didn't point out was the routing conditions. So when we to connect all these tasks together, we use the connectors. And the connectors are just a way of joining the dots. So it's the connectors that kind of make all the blue circles line up neatly in a row, in this case. And they kind of control what happens. So to read this page, we have the start. And then it says, well, where should I go when I start this workflow? So if I use this connector, it says, I can trigger by default. So that just means do it right away. Then it says, where should I go next? So I've told it to go to the notification step. And I say, do it at the moment it was triggered. Or I can say, wait one day before you do it, or maybe wait an hour. That's up to you. That's what I was talking about for the delays. But to answer the question is this routing conditions here. So maybe if I need to incorporate a new logic or branch, I can say, well, for these, maybe only do it for my community grants. If I do that, I can create another connector to still go to maybe notification or a different task. Maybe I don't want to send a notification for others. I can say connect to update field and do that one for the education grants. Okay, so now the system will look at this workflow and do two different things. So I basically bypassed the notification for my education grants. And if I look at my chart now, it goes here. So now I have a problem because I created a new link, but I didn't finish it off. I didn't say, well, now go here, go here. I've told this one to only work for community grants, and I've told this one to only work for education grants. But what about those other ones? What about foundation? What about online form? If those were triggered, the system now would not know what to do. It says, well, nope, you're not an education grant and you're not a community grant, so I'm just going to stop. I'm going to fail. So whenever you're building these connectors, it should be a closed loop. They need to account for every possibility. So in that case, you'd want to make sure all of your conditions or branches connect to something. In this case, I'd have to create a new connector to say, for all the other ones. So I'd have to account for foundation and online form and say, well, what do I do in those cases? I'm going to go somewhere else, right? And you would never go back to the start. But yeah, it's pretty tricky. So, be mindful of the connectors. Look at the diagram in terms of helping you troubleshoot. Or another way to handle a situation like that, if you're building out another process entirely, that's a good time to trigger another workflow. So even though this started on submit and I have my process in place, if it's for another grant type, then maybe for most people, if I do a new connector here after the create report, it just goes to complete. And then I'll make a new connector and I'll say for my other one that went to the workflow, only do that for my education grants. And then set up that other workflow, that second workflow, to do all the tasks that you needed in that new process. So now I still have my existing process. It's still sequential. I'm referring to another workflow only for the ones that I need to, and it still goes to complete. And then I'm good to go. and then that will, and if I delete these ones here for you, just so you can get a visual. And sorry guys, I know it's a little bit long-winded on this answer, but it's a very good question. It's probably one of the hardest things to account for. But now we can see our process here that's, again, sequential, sequential, sequential. And then it's like, oh, well, after I create the report, I can go here, trigger that other workflow, or I can just finish if I'm not the education grant and I'm done. So that's a good way to design a workflow to account for different processes.
When creating an activity, is it possible to copy the assigned contacts or organizations from the parent using a workflow?
You can. So that's another task type. So in that case, you'd, if I create a new task, there's these association, you can do these people associations, right? And they're pretty straightforward too. It's a drop down. I can add, update, and then I just need to use logic to say, grab the owner and put them in the, whatever. And if this doesn't work in the default options, then you can always use, your own syntax here to say who should be assigned to the level 2.
Can you quickly give a recap of what deactivate means?
Sure. So the triggers, normally a workflow is triggered by a status change. Okay. So when a grant, again, I'm going to keep referring to grants, but if I use a grant to trigger on submitted, it's going to do these tasks. Sometimes you don't want it to be a status-based trigger. Sometimes, like in my example, I could refer to another workflow and say, oh, you need to do these 5 steps now. So you can leave it as deactivate. So in my task here, and I go to trigger another workflow, my workflow called test, or add role, if we're going to use something more applicable. If I wanted to run that workflow now, I can leave the add role workflow as deactivated because I don't want it to trigger on a status change. I only want it to trigger when I refer to it. So by leaving it in deactivated, it allows us to refer to that workflow and only trigger it on demand. There's another way to trigger workflows via buttons. We call them system calls. So you can actually create a button, much like a print preview or things like that, to say, hey, I want to run this workflow now. And when you click the button, it says, oh, go out and do that workflow stuff. So that's another option or way to trigger workflows.
Can you specify the time that a workflow triggers? Like, for example, in 30 days, but at the end of the day, it's like midnight, for example.
Oh, that's up to you. So it's going to check every 5 minutes. The workflow process that runs on the server happens every 5 minutes. For those long-term SmartSimple clients, if you've heard us refer to as GORT, that's our internal funny name for the process that runs the scheduling. I'll tell you that story another day, but or how we came up with that name. But essentially, every 5 minutes it will trigger. When it does the delay, it actually depends on when the action took place. So sorry, if I go to my connector here and I use the delay, if I do 1 day, it's going to go 1 day from the exact time that it happened. So if I click if the workflow triggered right now, it'd be tomorrow at 11:34 a.m. Eastern time. Or I can say a particular time. I'm going to say, I want you to do 1 day, but do it at 7 a.m. So you have control over that. And you can even do, when you're doing the day count, you can refer to business days only. So we, by default, we refer, we use the stat holiday calendar for US and Canada. If that does not work for you, then you can specify your own calendar. You can create a holiday calendar within the system and use those to define what is a working day and what's not a working day.
So I believe they added something to this question. Would that deactivate a trigger only once or multiple times? For example, for notifications of notes, We are using Deactivate and for file upload as well, and it triggers multiple times. Does this mean we can use this for all workflows that we do not want to control by status?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, you can refer back to the same workflow. So yeah, so the notes, yeah, the deactivate just means, really what it means is to don't trigger on a status change. That's really what it means.
Can you show us what part of the system the reminder features are in?
Yeah, sure. I think I may have one ready. I'll test it out here. I'll go new activity. Yeah, I don't have them enabled, but let me show you where you can find them. So any activity, okay, so I'm in the settings page now for UTA. If I go to the activity and I go to a standard fields, okay, so these are fields that exist in every SmartSimple client's database, but not everybody uses them. Okay, so the ones that are in use, you can tell because they have a caption. So if they have a caption, then you know you're using them. So let's say I want to enable these reminder settings. To activate a standard field, I just have to select it, and then I can save it. Once I save it, that activates the standard field, and I can permission the field like any custom field, you know, who can see it by role, who can modify it, things of that nature. So I just activated the reminder. I'm going to also activate the reminder sent field. And finally, I'm going to activate the reminder type. So now that I've enabled these, I can go back to my grant. Here we go. And I'll open up this record again, and I will create a new activity. And now I have my default fields. Okay. So what this means is for this one record, right? It knows, you know, it has to. It's referring to the standard field date. Okay. The standard field start date in order to work. So that's one caveat there. But I can set a number of reminder days that are built in and say, I want to send a reminder 30 days here. And then how do I want to send it? I can send it to as an email. I can send it as an internal notification message or both. I can send it to several people. This toggle here, I could usually, I would suggest making it read only, but that will tell you when it was sent or not. So it'll say yes and or no. There's also, and I don't want to do it here on the webinar, but there's also a setting, a feature to enable recurring meetings. If that's enabled, you're going to get a button down here that says recurring. When you click it, you have a whole slew of options with which to set up recurring meetings. You can use these maybe as reminders. Maybe you want to have a reminder activity type. And then you can create, it almost works like Outlook. If you've ever used Outlook and create a calendar and you're setting up a recurring meeting, you know, I want to do the third Friday of every month, set up this task to do whatever. You can do things like that within the system too. But yeah, I think maybe the reminders is a whole other topic we could spend a good amount of time on. But yeah, I'm not too sure who asked the question, but if you want, please follow up with myself or the team, the business solutions at smartsimple.com, and we can you know, have a further discussion of how to use reminders. But I'm going to make note of that as well, as maybe that's another a great topic for another webinar. Reminders and all the things you ever wanted to know.
Can you show us where we would set up the built-in reminder feature? That was.
Oh, that I can't remember off the top of my head, so I need to go looking around for that. And I don't want everyone just seeing me click around the screen. But if you don't mind following up, just to be fully transparent, if you want to follow up with me after, I can show you where that exists.
Sounds good. What if I would like to terminate a workflow based on some condition other than status? Is there a way to achieve that?
No, that's you can only do it, the workflow the termination trigger is based on a status change. If you needed to, you can do it manually. So if you go to a workflow that has a pending tasks, I could go here, you know, you can multi-select any pending queues and stop them. But to do an automatic cancellation, then you need to use the termination trigger here, or do it manually through anything that's pending. Once the workflow is triggered, it's happening. So the only thing that you can stop is the pending queue anyway. So you either do that by a termination trigger, or you'd have to come here to the workflow, and if there was any activity that was still outstanding, you can stop them here.
Great. What would you say are the most common uses of workflows?
Common, it would be the ones that I was referring to today. So I'd say 100% of our clients are doing a notification email. Most of the time is on submission of a form. Updating fields is probably, well, updating fields maybe third. Generating PDF files is quite common. Almost everybody wants to convert those web page views, those are print forms, into a file to be used later. I'd say those are the most common, and it's more common now to be, automating creation of activities, and also the one of associating people. Now that we have those tasks available, they tend to be quite common. Another actually common one too is, I don't know if you weren't aware, one of the tasks is actually going out to third-party sources. So now that more people are using electronic signature, Charity Navigator, Guides, or Candid now for GuideStar, using them to go out and automate a check. So I can say, hey, before I issue that payment, go when a payment gets scheduled, go out and do a check on to make sure that the nonprofit is still in good standing, kind of.
If I have multiple workflows already built, how do I know which ones are actually running and which are dormant or not triggering?
Good question. So how do I know when workflows are working? So yeah, that's tough. It's hard to tell. If you go to the individual workflows, we have this here where you can see which ones they're referring to. In terms of history, you'll see when they've run. The pending queue will show you outstanding tasks. Also, a good indicator is here. In the main workflow screen, there's an outstanding tasks. This will show you all of the pending queues for all the workflows. So if there's anything kind of waiting to happen, it'll be here. Unfortunately for the history, I mean, even though workflows take 5 minutes to maybe start kicking into process, they happen right away. So once it's being triggered, once it's activated, it's running. So, there's no way to really, you can't stop it once it's there. So it would be to check the histories of the workflow, see when they last ran. That's if you're doing an audit of your workflows, which suggests you do on a regular basis, check the history. If it hasn't run in a year, maybe you don't need it anymore. Check the connections, right? Is anything referring to it? Is it referring to something else? That would be an indicator to maybe that it's important or in use. But really, I think the history and the workflow connections would be good spot checks, as well as on the main screen, see what outstanding tasks there are and what things are queued up, and that will tell you which workflows are currently in use. But yeah, it's a little bit of a investigation you'd have to do there.
Great. If I wanted to refresh all of my statuses, how would I go about triggering the refresh for all current records in all of my workflows?
Yeah, that's a big job. You'd have to go through each one. I mean, that has a lot of other implications. So if you want to, so if I understood the question correctly, you're looking to update your statuses that you're currently using in the system and refresh them. But that's going to have big effects everywhere. So that means any of your buttons could be affected. It's not just workflows. Logic, the smart check validation is connected to those buttons, which are connected to statuses. If you are changing statuses, I would maybe look to changing the caption. If it's just a naming convention that you're looking to change, That's why we have a caption feature. Just change the caption. If they're representing still things like draft or under review, and you're just looking to refresh the name, then just change the caption. That's not going to have any effect. And then that will be represented here in the dropdown, right? If I rename what's submitted as called, it's going to change here as long as it's the caption. If you're redefining a process altogether, then the best thing to do is use features like this. I can copy a workflow, okay? And so now I have an exact copy of my new workflow. I can assign it to my new status that I created. All the tasks are there, connectors are there. So that's very handy. So you may want to do that as a refresh and test it with the new status changes, and it won't affect the existing one that you have. That would be a place maybe I would start. Call us. Step one, call us. Step two, use features like this.
Sorry, Eric. They just clarified. They meant they wanted to refresh workflows, not statuses, but we can also answer that offline, maybe?
Yeah, same thing. I think it applies to both. You'd want to, if you want to refresh a workflow, maybe copy it, right? You can copy it, leave it deactivated, work through the process, right? Maybe you want to refine the process. Use a brand new workflow. So you don't have to recreate everything from scratch, but if you copy it, you can then, just tweak it. Maybe it's like, yeah, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. So I can delete that task, and then I can go through and fix my connectors to represent the new flow of things. And you can also copy tasks from one workflow to another. So you don't need to copy the whole workflow. I can export these tasks if I select them first. I can export them and then import them, just copy and paste the contents. And then I can import them into a new workflow. And now I'm going to get, it's good to say they already exist, but it'll import them into the other workflow that you have.
Is there a way to change the columns in the history?
No, these are all locked down.
Okay, and do we have any training videos on reminders available on Wiki or YouTube?
Good question. Maybe, although you will find a lot of that in the Wiki. If you do a search, I'll show you. If you go, Google's better for this. If you do reminders, SmartSimple Wiki, there we go, reminder templates. So this is the reminders feature. Oh, I think you may have deprecated that. Global settings. List view. Yeah, if you do a through here, reminders are pretty old. So you can do, probably won't be able to find it here, but it might be under activities, I think. But those reminder settings have been there since we created the platform. So they're pretty old feature. Here maybe event types talks about, yeah, it ties back to this. It's more under, you'll find it under like sort of CRM kind of thing. It's referring to, classic kind of event types. Again, that's a whole other topic. I'd suggest, again, if you want to self-educate, that's great. But for some of those reminder features, it may be best to reach out to us and kind of see how you want to use it and see if it would make sense for your organization.
Looks like that's all the questions we have today. So if anybody has any further questions, so please feel free to email us after.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, thanks for your time, everyone. I'll just put this back up here and go to the next slide. Yeah, so either if you have any specific questions about what I've talked about, always, emails are welcome to myself directly, or you can email the team, and we're more than happy to help you with any of the business-related questions you may have and how best to implement them into your version of SmartSimple. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Talk to you all soon.
Thank you.